All right, count me in whenever we're ready to start recording.
Oh, I started recording like 10 seconds ago.
Why would you do that?
Oh, it provides banter and filler material to put at the start of the episode.
Isn't that just going to sound like lazy and amateurish?
Eric, it's what everyone's doing. Welcome to Spec Media. Enjoy the episode.
Podcast premise is confusing enough as is.
All descriptions of events, people, planets, and species are real. Like fictional real. No fake fictional facts here. The observations, commentary, and analysis are our own. Spoiler warning. If this is, somehow, your first experience with the Star Wars universe, go watch the original trilogy first. If it isn't clear, what you're about to hear is a parody that is not affiliated with the podcast, networks, films, or TV series we're spoofing. Come on.
What you're about to hear is the second episode of a 4-part series on the ground war at the Battle of Endor. We traditionally recommend listening to the first episode to learn the backstory of the Empire and the Ewoks, and listening to this episode. But if you aren't a fan of traditional narrative, we think this episode will be pretty good on its own. There's an interaction, or event, shall I say. One history I read called it the skirmish at the Endor Shield bunker, and it perfectly captures the problems, the difficulties we encounter trying to tell the history of the battle for Endor. It starts at the Ewok village, Bright Tree Village, the main village we cover in this series. A scout hears a massive explosion, unlike anything they'd ever heard before. It was the Imperials landing on Endor, and they'd cleared an entire swamp to build the shield generator. Shortly after the explosions, a lone Dolok approaches Bright Tree Village. The Dolok warns the Ewoks about the Imperials. He says they took his village captive to use for slaves. Chief Chirpa of Bright Tree Village, though, doesn't believe him and instead imprisons the Dolok. However, Chief Chirpa's daughter, Nisa, partners with a scout named Wicket, a warrior named Tebow, and another Ewok named Latara to free the Dolok. They believed his story. So the Dolok and the Ewok set off towards the Imperial base. The Dolok shows them to where his village was, revealing the new Imperial garrison. Around it they see imprisoned Doloks being used for slave labor. They make a plan to rescue them. This plan is very convoluted, I'll just mention. It involved sneaking through underground caves, and it failed when the Dolok betrayed the Ewoks. In their escape from the Dolok, Wicket, Tebow, Latara, and Nisa stumble across a stormtrooper patrol. This patrol is 2 other Ewoks being held hostage. One is the village shaman, and the other is a warrior named Paplu. And the stormtroopers are about to execute them. And yes, all of these Ewoks play a role in the final battle to come. So the 4 Ewoks ambush the stormtroopers. A battle breaks out, and it ends in the death of all 4 of the stormtroopers. The fascinating part of this story is I don't know if any of it actually happened. I tried to extract the parts that are the most reasonable, but there are tons of other parts of this story that are even more outlandish. For instance, as the Ewoks tell the above story, in addition to ambushing the stormtrooper, they woke a giant monster and it ate some of those stormtroopers. The Ewok tale also hinges on the Dolok betraying the Ewoks, which isn't a surprising position for an Ewok story to take, since these 2 species fought fierce in legendary wars. And I haven't even mentioned a magic stone containing the power of the sun and a witch. But the craziest part of this entire account that I just read is this. The Imperial sources never mention it. And it makes you wonder why. This is where, when you're trying to piece together history, you have to ask why some sources mention some things and other sources leave them out. Who's lying, in other words? Or, to be generous, giving us their version of the history? Did the Imperials never mention it because it made them look so bad? Or did the Ewoks merely make it up so they seemed braver to the members of the Rebel Alliance? But why didn't the Rebels ever mention it? So they could look more heroic in the final battle? Or maybe the Rebels and Imperials never mentioned it because it never happened. As I tell you about the simmering war to come between the Imperials, Rebels, and Ewoks, it's important to acknowledge that each of these sources has their own agenda. I mean, we're talking about an evil dictatorship that suppresses free speech on one hand, a rebellion that wants to portray the Empire in the worst possible light, and on the third hand, a mystical bear people who didn't write anything down. As I wade through the prehistory of the Battle for Endor, it's important to know that we don't know what we don't know, but it's still fun trying to piece it all together.
This is the commander. Moments ago, this ship received word of a Cylon attack against our home worlds is underway. As of this moment, we are at war.
It's history.
The North remembers.
To Mordor and cast back into the fiery chasm from whence it came. The events.
Many Bothans died to bring us this information.
The only good bug is a dead bug.
Winter is coming.
The figure.
It will be a planet of apes.
The Fellowship of the Ring.
The drama.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over. The 4th of July will no longer be known as an American holiday.
We know no king, but the king in the
But
North.
as the day when the world declared in one voice, we will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. You shall not pass! Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.
It's a trap. It's hardcore history.
Imagine a world where Las Vegas set betting lines for historical conflicts. Instead of betting on March Madness or the Super Bowl or any other sport, you could bet on historical conflicts. What odds would you give the Germans to win World War II? They actually seem like they'd be pretty good at the start. What odds would you give to the Spartans to defeat the Persians? What odds would you give the free peoples of Middle Earth? They probably wouldn't be pretty good, but they had a couple kingdoms behind them. They could give it a shot. So if Las Vegas could set betting lines, what odds would they have given the Alliance to restore the Republic of defeating the Empire? 10 to 1? 100 to 1? 1,000 to 1? That almost seems too low. They never had a chance. The Empire didn't have just one, but multiple super weapons. The crown jewel, of course, and the focus of everyone on both sides was the Death Star, and then its successor, DS2. But they were developing a host of different super weapons, from world destroyers to sun crushers and more. And they already had a whole menagerie of weapons they could use to wipe out the rebels and scare bejesus out of the rest of the galaxy. They had the soldiers, millions of well-trained stormtroopers and Imperial officers. And they had conventional weapons, like Star Destroyers, a whole fleet of them, which I'd certainly count as a super weapon since it could turn the surface of any planet into molten lava. If that's not enough, they also had a super Star Destroyer nearly 19 kilometers in length. Accounts of the exact armament vary, but it's safe to say the Executor-class Dreadnought featured thousands of turbo lasers, concussion missiles, ion cannons, and lasers. And it was the personal vessel of Darth Vader, a cybernetic man-mountain who could allegedly use his mind to kill anyone he wanted. Again, in case I didn't make it clear, the rebels didn't have a shot. And yet the graveyard of military history is filled with superpowers that lost opponents they should have crushed. The Afghanistan or Vietnamese peoples holding off the Russians and the Americans. The British defeating the French at Agincourt. Or the free peoples of Middle-earth defeating Sauron. A few years ago, political scientist Ivan Aragon Toff asked the question, how often do underdogs win in wars? His answer? More often than you might think. As Malcolm Gladwell summarized in a New Yorker article, which later became a book, and I quote, "The Goliaths Aragon Toff found won in 71.5% of the cases. That is a remarkable fact. Aragon Toff was analyzing conflicts in which one side was at least 10 times as powerful, in terms of armed might and population, as its opponent, and even in those lopsided contests the underdog won almost a third of the time." End quote. Think about that. One country can have 10 times the resources of the other side and still lose. Be like playing a game of chess with just 4 pieces and still winning a third of the time. I should add the caveat that Professor Aragon Toff only analyzed Earth-based human wars in one timeline, but I think his results still stand. But at least the rebels had starships and blasters and Bacta-tanks for healing. What chance did the Ewoks have against the might of the Empire? As one veteran of Endor framed it, and I quote, "We, the Empire, had walkers, blasters, armor, speeder bike starships. What did the Ewoks have? Pointy sticks and a happy song." End quote. This is a question we'll keep coming back to. It's not so much how did the Ewoks win, but how did the mighty, nigh-invincible Empire lose? After the Emperor decided to build the shield generator on the forest moon of Endor, what's the next thing he had to do? Build a base. Even on one of the most hidden, remote planets in the galaxy, or moon in this case, you don't take any chances. The Emperor wanted to make sure his secret stayed safe until he sprung his trap. For the Imperial military, this meant a large conventional base with conventional defenses designed to defeat a rebel attack. This conventional base, as we'll see, was the best of the Empire and the worst at the same moment. Or better yet, it's like that Clint Eastwood movie, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's start with the good. Sure, the Emperor sent conventional forces, but he sent a lot of them. As a side note, this theme seems to occur again and again with the Empire. Never do anything small. He didn't just send out one survey team, he sent out hundreds on a mission that he was trying to keep secret. He doesn't just build a second Death Star, he builds an even bigger second Death Star. He doesn't just send a company of soldiers, he sends a legion of his best stormtroopers. And the amount of firepower the Empire brought to bear, no pun intended, on the small moon is incredible. I mean truly incredible. This will be one of those moments where I geek out over the weapons and warfare of a time period, so just indulge me. I know some of you are bored by this, but others of you love it, so just indulge us even if you don't care about these weapons. Let's start with the garrison. The Empire spent a lot of time taking over remote planets around the galaxy, spent occupying them with their elite troops, and having to build bases to house those elite troops. They did this so often that they even had prefabricated bases built and stored on their Star Destroyer. So a Star Destroyer pulls up to a rebel planet, or just any planet it wants to control. Then it just flies its prefabricated garrison down to the surface, and now it is an occupied planet. If you can just drop one of these, there's no need to deal with contractors on the ground. It's worth taking a step back to realize how many planets you must be conquering when you're forced to build prefabricated bases to save money. And like so many things Imperial, it hired a company to build these bases, Rothana Heavy Engineering. A copy of their brochures and the Imperial Handbook for Military Officers, and it is so good I just have to read a line. I quote, "As the commander of an MI-455 modular garrison, you are in possession of an impregnable fortress that stands as a symbol of Imperial power." End quote. Inside that garrison were the soldiers, some of the fiercest soldiers in any known universe. And the Emperor sent his best, the most elite stormtrooper legion, the Tempest Force. According to some manuals, a stormtrooper legion consisted of 9,000 troops with 16 battalions of 576 men at full strength. Likely the Emperor didn't send an entire legion to Endor, but a battalion or multiple battalions of the Tempest Force, but still he sent a lot. As a caution, many different stormtrooper units claim the mantle of best in the galaxy. After all, no one hangs a second best military banner in their barracks. Stormtroopers were the Empire's best troops, a separate branch from the Army. Sort of like how the Marines and the Army and the US military are different branches, but basically do the same thing. Before I get emails, I know Marines, their core mission is to take beachheads, but tell that to Marines in the later years of the Iraq War who had no beachheads to take. Some accounts, mainly written after the war, love to describe stormtroopers as incompetent. If some holo vids are to be believed, stormtroopers couldn't hit the broadside of an asteroid shooting 4 feet away. But that is wishful thinking at best, or propaganda at its worst. Stormtroopers, as I've said before, belong in the annals of great militaries. Many contemporary accounts describe stormtroopers as nasty guys. They inspired fear just by showing up. These were the best of the best. Elite shock troopers designed to frighten as much as to destroy. I quote again from the Imperial Handbooks. Stormtroopers are the knife's edge. We are the first to go in. We face the enemy when they are strongest. We do not stop until we have achieved our objective. The Imperial Army walks in the path we blaze. If we are fewer in number than the assembled ranks of the Army and Navy, that is just as it should be. The narrower the blade, the sharper the edge. End quote. But ground troops never go into battle alone. They also had armor. The force sent down to the forest moon had at least one all-terrain armored transport, or AT-AT, or AT-AT, and nearly 40 all-terrain scout transport, AT-STs. Here's how the Imperial Handbook describes AT-ATs, and I quote, standing over 20 meters tall with blast-impervious armor plating, these massive constructs are used as much for psychological effect as they are for tactical advantage. End quote. The AT-STs had twin blasters and could patrol the forests around the Imperial base. In addition to all of those vehicles, the Imperials brought speeder bikes for scouting and had TIE fighters flying overhead, patrolling to provide aerial bombardment should they see anything that needed shooting. Looking at the armaments and men and firepower sent to the forest moon, it's hard to see how any force could hope to penetrate the base's defenses. But again, the graveyard of history is filled with armies who brought the wrong weapons into battle with them. The most famous example is France's Maginot Line, which the Nazis just drove around. Or look at America's current war in Afghanistan. Our nearly invisible to radar, incredibly fast fighter jets like the F-22 Raptor still haven't flown a single combat mission in that incredibly long war. Or look at the mobile infantry on Clendathu. They brought assault rifles to a fight when they needed heavy artillery and machine guns, if not robotic sentries. So let's look at the bad. I mentioned the good, the bad, and the ugly in the introduction. On the one hand, the force the Empire brought to Endor is just awesome in battle. It's just more awesome against humans in urban settings than a thick jungle forest. Take the AT-ATs and the AT-STs. AT-ATs were designed to terrify. But who are they terrifying in the middle of a forest? Outside of that Gorax we mentioned last episode, I doubt anyone else cared. Sure, the Ewoks feared AT-STs at first, but later they felt AT-STs were just another creature to be hunted. And none of these vehicles were optimized for fighting in one of the densest forests in the galaxy. These are vehicles designed almost exclusively for urban pacification. As Phil B. Jorn warned in his initial report from the second survey, I quote, "While our AT-STs could maneuver through some of the thickest foliage, I'd consider it impossible for a larger AT-AT to make its way beyond the largest clearings." End quote. Jorn was wrong about AT-STs, though. Surely their nimble legs would make for better transportation? Nope. Again, from Jorn, I quote, "Still, even our smaller scout walkers suffered several mishaps on our plodding journey through the forest. I can't begin to list all the times we stumbled in treacherous and hidden gullies concealed by the underbrush. We wasted many hours disassembling twisted metal knee joints and repairing them, occasionally even battering bent components with rocks just to make them fit back into their appropriate sockets." End quote. Even the speeder bikes really make no sense if you think about it. On flat ground, sure, speeder bikes were extremely agile airborne vehicles. But zooming around those trees, only a madman would pilot those. If you've ever played a simulation of flying a speeder bike on Endor, and I have, you know that the computer spends most of the time making sure you don't hit any of the trees. And there's a lot of them, and even then you're still hitting them all the time. It's just almost impossible to fly a speeder bike in one of these forests. Plus, and I have to mention this, due to what we can only assume was poor construction, speeder bikes would blow up at the slightest amount of contact. I mean, if it had hit a tree, it just exploded. And what about that fearsome air support mentioned above from the TIE fighters? TIE fighters were notoriously bad in atmosphere. And the TIE fighters couldn't see through the canopy. These were, by some accounts, 1,000-foot tall trees. How do you target anything on the ground from that high up, especially if you can't see through the foliage? Finally, what about those elite stormtroopers the Emperor personally sent, the Tempest Force? These are about some of the worst jungle troops you can imagine. Their fearsome armor is great for urban pacification, as the Emperor wanted most of the time. But it's absolutely awful in the forest, white on black. Could anything stick out worse in a jungle environment? Then their helmets. They were designed to hide their faces and appear more intimidating. Those helmets also limited their visibility. And none of this should have come as a surprise. Lieutenant Kvyat suggested in his first report, I quote, "Even my suggestion that forced camouflage be applied to all vehicles and armor was summarily dismissed." End quote. It's worth pausing again at this point to look at how poorly planned so many parts of the operation were. The moon is bad terrain to begin with. It's filled with dangerous threats the Empire mostly ignored, and ignored these threats because the Empire sent poorly trained and equipped teams to do the reconnaissance. Then they sent their elite soldiers and weaponry to guard the base, but failed to equip them properly for the terrain they were fighting in. What were they thinking? We mentioned xenophobia last episode, which explains some of these mistakes. If you can't properly analyze your enemy because your deluded perspective doesn't recognize the strengths of non-human beings, you can't properly fight them. But other factors played in as well. Xenophobia, after all, has nothing to do with sending urban conflict weapons into a jungle. But what does? Fear. It's hard to tell who was more afraid. The people the Empire forced under their thumb, or the people doing the enforcing. The entire backbone of the Imperial strategy depended on local populaces being cowed into submission. As we covered in the last episode, it's the Tarkin Doctrine. But this same dynamic played out on every level of the Imperial military. Take a quote from one of our primary sources, a veteran of the Battle of Hoth and Endor. It really illustrates this fear that I'm talking about. This veteran mentions Hoth, a battle that the rebels lost. This was a major victory. It sent the rebels reeling across the galaxy with no hope of establishing another base on a planet. But Darth Vader considered the mission to be a failure for failing to capture the Millennium Falcon and its occupants. Luke Skywalker, according to many, was Vader's estranged son, and Vader wanted him captured. It's a backstory we may get into later. But I quote from that veteran after the battle. "The Dark Lord told us it wasn't our fault the Falcon got out from the Hoth blockade. Then he executed half the squad. But you could tell he was proud of us." End quote. Just analyze that statement. Look at the delusion, the complete buy-in to Imperial propaganda. It's Stockholm Syndrome. It shows just how brainwashed many of these soldiers were. And it wasn't just lower-level soldiers. After the rebels destroyed Death Star 1, what did its lead designer do? He ran away. And I quote from one historian, "After the first Death Star was destroyed, Bevel Lemelisk went into hiding, fearing for his life. When Imperial intelligence agents tracked him down at his remote retreat on Heffy, he thought he was doomed. He was quite surprised to discover that the Emperor did not want his head. Said the Emperor wanted him to design a new, more powerful Death Star battle station, this time without even the most minute design flaw. Amazed at his good fortune, Lemelisk went to work. He would not disappoint the Emperor a second time." End quote. More to the point, Vader was infamous for killing any of his generals or admirals who failed him in any way. He killed Admiral Ozzel when he screwed up the Battle of Hoth. He killed Inspector Thanos when he discovered his real identity. He killed Captain Nita and Captain Supervisor Grammel when they screwed up. And those are just some of the people we know about. But how many times can you murder your top generals, your best leadership, until you have none left? At least, none that are competent. It's like the psychopath version of Jack Welch. You remember him? He was the CEO in the 1980s, famous for leading General Electric. And every year he would cull the bottom 10% of his organization. Lord Vader did the same thing, except instead of a pink slip, he choked you to death with his mind. You can guess the results of this policy. You'll have a group of leaders terrified of failure because failure means death. Or the good people work just hard enough not to be killed, but not to get promoted to the level where they could be choked to death by a cybernetic force-wielding psychopath. The Empire almost assuredly suffered from an imperial brain drain, losing its top leaders to, essentially, repeated fratricide. This group of terrified leaders was also more likely to follow the book. After all, You don't get killed for doing exactly what the book says you should do. So when you get to the forest moon, you build a strong defense with that pre-built garrison to keep out any rebels who may sneak in if they discover the location of your shield generator. And in this case, your defenses are probably more than capable. But you also ignore the locals, which this team of sycophants or incompetents did. Earlier, I briefly mentioned the difficulty in sourcing information about the Galactic Civil War. Remember, this war happened a long time ago. It's almost prehistorical. Some things we know quite well, but we have considerable blind spots in other areas, and the Ewoks are one such blind spot. An arboreal species who lacked written records, the Ewoks had an oral history passed down from generation to generation. Except this oral tradition was immediately corrupted when they encountered humans who had their own stories and a tenuous grasp of the Ewok language. In other words, no Ewoks were writing down their history, so when humans came and wrote it down for them, they likely got multiple details wrong. So what do we know about the Ewoks? The best description probably comes from the speciest account of Lieutenant Kiviat. This comes from the histories of Lieutenant Voren Nall. I mentioned him last episode, but just quickly mention, Nall was a New Republic historian that the New Republic hired and used to write a history and gather intelligence. He interviewed almost every one of the important figures in this war, with the exception of the Empire and Darth Vader, because they died. One of the people he interviewed was Lieutenant Kiviat, who led that first survey of the forest moon. Kiviat wrote this: "Our scans revealed thousands of life forms. The life seemed to be primarily of lower orders with a primitive civilization. Scans showed nothing more than advanced villages of tree houses deep in a forest inhabited by a species averaging roughly 1 meter in height." End quote. Or from another species, Philby Jorn. "The most common creatures on Endor are the obnoxious Ewoks, feral and deceptively cute hairy things that seem to consider themselves our equals. Ewoks practically infest the forest with their tree villages." End quote. Though they had a primitive culture, and I use this term loosely, in danger of repeating stereotypes perpetuated by historians of the multiverse to this day, they still had a surprisingly advanced knowledge of engineering. Pre-industrial might be the better term. But for a pre-industrial society, you marvel at what they built. We know that the Ewoks had perfected the ability to use gliders. That's right, the Ewoks knew how to build and fly gliders. We know this from accounts of one of the most famous Ewoks, Wicket. He told the rebel historians of using a glider, and gliders would be used by the best Ewoks in the Battle of Endor. The Ewoks have also manufactured a variety of tools and weapons, mostly built out of wood and stones. They were still sophisticated in design. This includes bows and arrows up to slingshots, even catapults. The Ewoks lived in almost any climate that you could imagine. It just gives you a sense of how hardy this species was. The Ewoks we think of most commonly lived high amongst the giant trees of Endor, as referenced by both scouting reports and took place in the battle. Think of the difficulty and technology it would take to scale a tree dozens of meters in the air, then build platforms and homes that could house dozens and dozens of people, or Ewoks, I guess, in this case. That's not easy. And you can see why they had to build such amazing structures. If you live in constant fear of Gorax raids or being mauled by boar wolves, or you live in semi-war with Dolax and Marauders, you need to adapt to survive. You get tough and you get smart. They put their villages high in the trees to avoid Dulok and Gorax raids, but not high enough to be attacked by Condor dragons. That's brilliantly adaptable, isn't it? Other Ewoks communities made homes in the middle of lakes or on the sides of cliffs. These communities often use waterfalls as a source of mechanical energy. And like other indigenous peoples across the multiverse, the Sentinelese, the Korowai, and the Na'vi, they had a near-perfect understanding of the forest. Again, this can seem primitive because it seems like they aren't using science. Framed in another way, it could be described as a knowledge lost to current generations. Using their knowledge, the Ewoks built an extensive society based on hunting and trapping without destroying their native ecology. That said, they both respected and feared the forest and its many dangers. Take this account of the Imperial scouting party, and I quote, The Ewoks quietly observed the passage of the Imperial scouting party. There was something disquieting in the way they walked through the forest, not afraid of being heard, not afraid of being followed. The Imperials' obvious contempt for their surroundings spoke of power and fearlessness. Such fearlessness was frightening to the Ewoks. They decided that the Imperials must be prevented from reaching the Ewoks' villages. End quote. And this forest tied into their religion. The Ewoks had a sophisticated religious system that would turn out to be surprisingly important in the events to come. The Ewoks respected the forest, but also believed their ancestors inhabited their souls in trees. But crucially for our story, the Ewoks also believed that a golden god had helped the Ewoks in the past and would return to do it again. He was sometimes called the Golden One or Golden God. To show respect to this god, they turned to the darkest part of their religion, the sacrifice of living creatures. The Ewoks are hardly the first society to sacrifice things to their god. Humans have been doing it for millennia. But the Ewoks sacrificed other living beings. And it's unclear if these were just animals or if included other intelligent species living on Endor. We also have fairly good evidence that the Ewoks fought fierce wars. Again, I said this was a tough neighborhood. But this is really like any native people who live in a forest. When it gets crowded, the tribes can bump into each other, and that inevitably leads to war. The Ewoks themselves didn't have a history they shared with the rebels about their warfare. After all, if strange aliens land on your planet, you're probably not going to emphasize the fact that you've been warring with your neighbors for generations. I doubt if aliens landed on Earth, the first thing we'd tell them about would be Hitler in World War II. But multiple accounts say that the Ewoks, especially Bright Tree Village, conducted brutal wars with neighboring people, especially the Doloks, which were a genetically related but distinct species. But if the Ewoks were fighting wars with each other, the question remains, did the Empire think they posed a threat? Well, Lieutenant Kiviat later told historians this, and I quote, "Whatever happens to me, they can't say I didn't warn them. This whole Ewok thing, I saw it coming from the very beginning." End quote. The actual report that went to Vader and the Empire read, I quote again, "The only conceivable threat is presented by furred dwarf bipeds. Their technology is laughably primitive. The spears, bows, and slings of these pathetic savages pose no threat to disciplined Imperial stormtroopers. We can safely ignore those contemptible little furballs." End quote. Obviously, he'd turn out to be very, very wrong. I ended the first episode of this series describing how the Imperials had at least one encounter with the Ewoks. It ended in a massacre. What we don't really know is what the Ewoks or the Imperials did after this encounter. The Imperial forces had roughly 3 options to deal with the indigenous population, which of course in this case is the Ewoks. Option 1 you could call the dark side approach. In this case, the Empire would try to exterminate the locals and in some cases enslave them for labor to help build whatever it was they were building. Option 2 you could call the light side approach. Befriend the Ewoks, use them as allies to help you build your base and warn you in case the rebels showed up. This would be a version of what Julius Caesar offered some Gallic tribes during his wars, though he too would also massacre his enemies if they didn't become his friends. The third option is just benign neglect. Ignore the locals, hope they don't cause too much trouble. Well, we know option 2, the light side, didn't happen. The Empire didn't become known as a force for evil by befriending local, non-human populations. And as we covered in our last episode, this was a military defined by their racism, sexism, and xenophobia. But there's quite a bit of controversy in the record over whether the Imperial forces tried to murder or enslave the Ewoks or whether they just left them alone. There are multiple stories about Ewoks and Imperial interactions, shall I say, before the rebels arrive, and most of them contradict each other. Again, it's hard to separate fact from fiction, what is apocryphal from what isn't. In one version, the Imperial base wasn't built on a clearing identified in the first Imperial survey, but in a drained swamp. Instead of just clearing the area, they cleared a Dolok village, enslaving or massacring every living being in it. In another dark side version of the story, which somewhat contradicts that one, this one from New Republic sources, the Imperials landed and destroyed an entire Ewok village to make room for the shield generator. The surviving Ewoks fled to Chief Chirpa of the Bright Tree village. But how reliable are these sources? On the one hand, most first-hand accounts from the Ewoks fail to mention these atrocities. Even the Rebel Alliance historian Lieutenant Warren Nall, for example, he doesn't describe the Imperials murdering or massacring the Ewoks, and he had all the reason in the world to spin the Empire in a bad light. On the other hand, we know that the Galactic Empire had no compunction against using slave labor. Heck, the first Death Star used convicts and later Wookiees in its construction. And indeed, at least 2 different historical accounts depict the Empire using the local Ewoks as slave labor to build their shield generator. Many historians rightfully dismiss these accounts. The Ewoks, by all measures, had no understanding of basic technology. What use would they be for building a base for the Empire? You'd spend more time teaching them how to use a hydrospinner than having them work. That said, Ewok villages were so densely populated that it wouldn't be surprising if the Empire had to clear some out to make room. The benign neglect option makes a little more sense in this context. In this version, the Empire established their perimeter, ignored the Ewoks entirely, possibly destroying an entire Ewok village to make room. Being skeptical, though, of course, one wouldn't expect stormtroopers to admit to mass murder. This quote from Lieutenant Nall about Bright Tree Village makes it sound like the Ewoks didn't spend any time with the Imperials either, but just talking about them at night. I quote, "The monster's arrival caused much discussion around the council fires. Until that time, the Imperials had paid the Ewoks no attention." End quote. The Imperial accounts back this up. This quote from Hume Tarl, a sergeant in the Tempest Squad, provides the best summary of this version of events. I quote, "Our survey teams had discovered the indigens, of course. You think we'd establish a shield generator protecting a project this important without a thorough survey? They were primitives, hairy bipeds with spears and slings living in treehouses. We paid them no mind. They didn't seem inclined to cause problems begging or stealing things, which is what most abos like to do. That would have led to an excision within a defined perimeter." End quote. By the way, I love this euphemistic expression, excision within a defined perimeter, which really shows you how the Imperials thought about mass murder. It's simply a bureaucratic decision. Once the Imperial forces landed, the Ewoks had to decide how to respond. And even if the Imperials had started out ignoring the Ewoks couldn't ignore the deforestation and constant patrols of the stormtroopers. And very likely the Imperials probably did murder some Ewoks. That first-hand account which we used to close the last episode, or the other account we used to open this episode, have to account for something. In all likelihood, the Imperials probably made the worst of all decisions. Kill enough Ewoks to make them very angry, but not enough to wipe them out. Which meant that the Ewoks had their own decision to make. And they decided to fight back. In reality, the battle for Endor actually started months or possibly years before the rebels even arrived. It was a long-running counterinsurgency campaign between the Galactic Empire and what they considered to be contemptible little furballs. 2 Ewoks likely had the most say in this decision. They both resided in Bright Tree Village, which appears to have been the most populous and powerful village in this section of Endor, if not controlling all of the Ewoks in the area. Again, the forest moon had mountainous regions, lakes, and deserts, and the Ewoks lived in all of them, but Bright Tree Village was the closest to the shield generator. The leader of Bright Tree Village was Chief Chirpa. At the time of the battle, he was very old and already showing his age. He'd been the village chief for 42 seasons, according to the Ewoks, and was well respected. I should mention, though, I have no idea how long a season on Endor even lasts. Chief Chirpa was a superstitious man, or I guess in this case Ewok, and some stories even have him consulting his pet iguana for advice. Just gives you an idea of who this Ewok was. I don't mean to demean him or his traditions, but this is just bizarre behavior. Chirpa also heavily followed the advice of his medicine man/shaman Logray that I'll get into in a second. Some of the more romanticized histories downplayed Chirpa's bellicose nature, arguing he just had some hunters who followed him. Other accounts recall multiple wars between the Ewoks and the Dologs, with Chirpa leading the charge. These accounts, Chirpa could be a wise and a good leader, but also prone to anger. Remember that story I opened the episode with? Here's how Chirpa responded when the Dulok was initially brought to him, begging for help. When Duloks approach Bright Tree Village, they're gutted on sight, not brought to my home. End quote. It makes wise Chief Chirpa sound more like a tribal Genghis Khan, doesn't it? The second most powerful person in the village was Logray. Logray is described as either a medicine man or a shaman. He wore the skull of dead animals as he guarded the ancient rites, and I'm putting that in quotes. Logray, or Logray, again, this is a pronunciation issue, is a fascinating character because you often see these wise religious influences popping up throughout history, and you wonder if they're the real power behind the throne. A good example was the Druid wise men influencing the Gaelic tribes in the war with Julius Caesar, or the Christian priests during the many wars of religion during the Crusades, or even the role Gandalf the Grey played in the War of the Ring between the people of Gondor, Rohan, and Mordor. And Logray was no different and no less feared. A good description of him comes from Philby Jorn, though we should say the information comes from a member of his squad who was more, let's say, open to communicating with the Ewoks, and he studied them in depth. Though I should mention that Jorn added his own, shall we call it, commentary. I quote, "In times of crisis, Ewok shamans attempt to communicate with the ancient spirits residing within the oldest trees to ask for advice. Being the village con artists, the shamans naturally insist that this is an intensely private ritual." End quote. Ewok shamans also played the role of healers in addition to their roles as religious leaders. And we know that Logray helped convince Chief Chirpa to support the rebels and played a key role in the battle to come. In the darker side of the story, and I think we find on Endor, there's always a darker side. Logray was a primary proponent of the dark rites, which involves sacrificing other living beings. So the Ewok put their trust in these two people, Chirpa and Logray. Together, they responded to the Imperials by alternating between avoiding them and actively fighting them. I say alternating because we have versions from both sides that say they either had no interaction or were fighting a low-level but bloody war. Let's start with the avoiding any Imperial entanglements version from the Ewok perspective. Clearly, the Imperials were bad news, and the first response of the Ewoks was to avoid them. In the account provided by Sergeant Hume Tarl to Sindel Talway, he says, and I quote, "But like I said, they seemed afraid of us. They didn't like approaching the shield generator, and we didn't think we'd be staying long enough for them to get acclimated and become a problem." End quote. Of course, Tarl likely didn't know that he was constantly being spied on by the Ewoks from the moment they landed on the planet. It should also be noted that when the rebels first encountered the Ewoks at Bright Tree Village, the Ewoks acted as if they had never fought the stormtroopers or even met any humans. They had been attacking stormtroopers. The Ewoks conveniently forgot to mention it. But the Ewoks had their own dark side version of the story. This is when the Ewoks switched from spying to fighting the Imperials. I have one anonymous account of a soldier. I quoted him earlier in this episode, that veteran of the Hoth battle. And we don't have his name, probably why he seems more honest than the other accounts we have. In his story, almost immediately after Imperial soldiers started killing Ewoks, they started fighting back. One of his fellow soldiers goes missing. Then, the psychological warfare begins. I quote, "A few days after first contact, we met those monsters again. That was the first night we heard their drums in the darkness. All through the night, we'd hear them drumming, doom, 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 doom. We started to go crazy." End quote. This isn't the first time we've heard about the Ewoks and their drumming. It's an ongoing theme and one of the Ewoks' many uses of psychological warfare. You might remember that first scouting patrol that the Empire sent to Endor. They were lost in the woods. And they too became haunted by noises, the doom, doom, doom of the drumming that caused them to fire wildly into the night. Clearly, the Ewoks knew how to use the sounds of the forest to haunt their enemies. And this seems to be a good time to mention another theme running through the sources, a theme that somewhat contradicts entirely the version of events that the Ewoks were contemptible little furballs. This is the fact that the Ewoks ate their enemies. That quote I just read, I actually cut it off earlier. I didn't read the entire thing, so I'll finish it now. "We found what was left of Kovacs a few days later. They'd done things to him, figured they wanted to take his spirit into themselves." End quote. These are the dark rites conducted by Logra I mentioned earlier. I hesitate to call it cannibalism. That refers to eating your own species, and humans and Ewoks are not the same species. But it is eating another sentient creature, which is something most species across the multiverse tend to avoid. Of course, the other major incident between the Ewoks and Imperials was the skirmish I discussed in the opening. There are other accounts of fighting between Ewoks and Imperials, though some, I think, are too exaggerated and ridiculous to be believed. So the Ewoks started out ignoring the Imperials, but then started fighting them in various encounters. I don't know that I'd call this a low-level insurgency. I mean, the Imperials didn't have a government to insurgent against. But it's definitely skirmishing and fighting, not enough fighting to provoke a full response, but enough to scare the stormtroopers. But the Ewoks prepared for much more. That brings us to probably the most famous character in this story, Wicket the Ewok, who, full disclosure, is a personal favorite of mine. Wicket is one of those characters in history who just always seems to show up in major historical moments. He's like Endor's version of Forrest Gump. And again, I said this before, but my pronunciation of his name here is probably off, given that this was an Ewok tongue and we don't have recordings of Ewoks even saying their own names. We actually have very few recordings of Ewoks being called Ewoks either. Wicket was young at the time of the events of the Battle for Endor, but was already known in Bright Tree Village for, let's say, his youthful exploits. Despite constantly getting in trouble with Chief Chirpa, he was a prominent scout, or even the lead scout of Bright Tree Village, depending on which account you're reading. After the battle, he was promoted to lead warrior of the village. Either way, he played a crucial role in convincing the Ewoks that they could and should fight the Imperials in the final battle. The key role he played, most likely in his role as a scout, was learning the weaknesses of Imperial armor. The story goes that for weeks Wicket had scouted the Imperials. Again, Hume Tarl didn't see the Ewoks, but they certainly saw him. One night, Wicket approached the village elders. He'd never spoken in front of them before. He tells a story about an ATST, what he calls a walking knot animal. I quote, "It was one of the large walking knot animals of the invaders. It had been walking near the base of the Yawari cliffs. There were many rocks, and I thought that there had been a slide. The knot animal stepped carelessly on one side of the larger rocks. It seemed for a moment that it had lost its mind or was drunk. It jerked around, almost like dancing, and hit its head against the face of the cliff. Then it fell over sideways, and its hard skin cracked, and there were flames under the belly and inside its head. I could see the forest through its open eyes, and then it screamed, and its voice was an echo, like two voices screaming." End quote. It's a fascinating quote there. Again, we can see that most Imperial weaponry, if damaged slightly, would just explode in a giant fireball. We also know that the two voices were the pilots trapped inside, burning alive. Allegedly, Chief Chirpa asked Wicket what this meant. He replied, "They can be hurt." Chirpa agreed. He ordered the village to be prepared to fight the invaders, as the Ewoks called them. He wanted to be ready if they had to fight the Imperials. And they were prepared. I want to take a step back, leave that forest moon, and look at where the Empire's position strategically is compared to the Rebellion at this moment. Death Star 2 is so well hidden, the Rebels never would have found it. And they have a shield generator casting a force field around the entire thing. And even if they had discovered it, found a way to then get rid of the shield generator, there was still a massive Super Star Destroyer with Darth Vader at the helm overseeing the whole thing. And they have the Tempest Force, some of the best stormtroopers in the Empire, guarding the shield generator on the Force floor. And once it's complete, nothing could have stopped it. This quote from Voron Nall sums it up, referring to Bevel Lemelisk, the designer of both Death Stars. I quote, "Lemelisk didn't believe that anything could defeat the new Death Star when presenting the new design to the Emperor. Lemelisk boldly claimed that the only way the new Death Star could be destroyed would be if it were attacked while still under construction. Once completed, it would be invulnerable." End quote. But the Emperor still has the Rebel Alliance to deal with. They're gaining followers, they're gaining strength, and they destroyed his previous super weapons. The Emperor wants to finish off this band of plucky freedom fighters, once and for all. So he devises a plan. Palpatine, I should know, was a fan of elaborate plans and deceptions. If you listen to my series on the Clone Wars, you'll remember that some theories about Palpatine speculated that he caused the entire crisis by playing both sides. A classic Xanatos gambit guaranteeing he'd win either way. Palpatine engineers it so a military convoy is captured by Bothan spies, and it just happens to be carrying the full plans for the second Death Star, including its defenses and location. This happened when the rebels intercepted the Imperial freighter Saprosa that hid a computer core containing the plans for the second Death Star. During this attack and the transit of the computer core to the Alliance, multiple Bothan and Imperial ships were destroyed as the Imperials attempted to make their ruse seem believable. And the rebels bought it. But Palpatine let even juicier information fall into rebel hands. That he and Darth Vader, the joint Hitler and Genghis Khan of this galaxy, will be on board to supervise the construction. Why? So he can lure them in and finish them off. He believed the rebellion would bring all their offensive firepower to destroy the second Death Star and kill him. He believes this because he knows how invincible his Death Star will be. And you know what? He's right. The rebels attack with everything they've got. Sir hu governeth na tulibui Squarespace a huiswe tenana a bien website ben blog. Squarespace na huiswi a thuithwi a haswen bien templates o ek nur. Sintur penne e theater dilthin trui. Fuer he sintur glen na Squarespace peg com ana la trial a sir huithwa a e offer code fake ad.